Chapter 12. As they drove down off the mountain into the valley, the garishly lit town of Las Vegas greeted them. The temperature in the desert that Friday night was 85. The daytime had seen the thermometer soar to 112. The lights of the town glittered in the clear desert sky. Kenyatta leaned forward and took in the sight. Memories of his desert plane crash flooded his mind. Visions of the ranch and the beautiful white woman who had made her intentions very clear drew a surge from his loins. Elliot Stone battled the strong desert winds, keeping the car far from the right-hand side of the two-lane highway. His heart was pounding now as he drove down the hill and into the city.
"Man,"
Stone said.
"that's some sight."
"Uh-huh," Kenyatta replied.
"And that fucker ain't never gonna be the same after we get through with it."
The words sent a chill up Stone's spine. They were the invaders approaching their objective. Single-handedly, they would attempt to smash the power structure that supplied heroin to the men, women, and children of Watts, 285 miles to the southwest. In the midst of the pretty neon lights and happy people was a vicious operation, a death-dealing force that had taken the lives of more men and women, mostly black, than Stone or Kenyatta would ever know about.
"You know,"
Stone said,
"when I was a kid, I always wanted to make it to this town. I dug the whole scene. Lights, music, beautiful chicks. It seemed like some kind of dream place to me, you dig?"
Kenyatta nodded. He looked at the handsome black man driving the car and realized, for the first time in a long time, just how young Stone was.
"Yeah, I could dig it,"
Kenyatta replied. Stone chuckled.
"And now we're hitting the fucker. Only it ain't for fun and games. We're coming here to kill, Kenyatta. This is the first time I've ever made it to Vegas, man."
Kenyatta laughed, turned, and glanced at Seamus curled up on the back seat, sound asleep.
"Man,"
Kenyatta said,
"we're coming here to get rid of a killer, not to kill. Dudes like our fucker in the back and his men, they're the killers. We're trying to keep our people alive long enough so they can make it. Dead and sick and don't do nobody no good, you dig? You dig what the fuck I'm coming from?"
The signs along the highway leading into the city announced the appearance of Frank Sinatra in an opening night at Caesar's Palace the next evening. Kenyatta looked at each one of these, and the idea grew in his mind steadily.
"Man,"
he said to Stone,
"Sinatra's gonna be doing the gig here tomorrow night."
Stone nodded and waited for Kenyatta to continue.
"You ever hear what comes down when Old Blue Eyes plays? Well, I'll tell you, Elliot. The whole fucking town goes bananas. The big spenders come in from all over, the high rollers. The organization's boys all jam that theater to hear him. It's one of the real happenings, you dig where I'm coming from?"
Stone shook his head. He wasn't sure what Kenyatta was leading up to.
"Okay, man,"
Kenyatta said.
"The town empties, makes it over to where he's opening, right? The big boys from all over town. So while he's singing his songs, man, we strike."
"Uh-huh," Stone replied.
"I could dig it, Kenyatta, but we have to make a hit right down the street, man, and those cats will be right on top of us." "It depends, Elliot,"
Kenyatta replied.
We don't know where the meeting's taking place, right? No matter. As long as it's in the town and not in the fucking desert somewheres, we'll be dealing with a lot less security. They'll be covering Sinatra and his audience." "Man,"
Stone chuckled.
"Seems like everything's working right down the line for us. It seems like a stroke of pretty fine luck heading our way, you dig?"
Kenyatta smiled.
"Sometimes, Elliot, things just come together in such a way as to make you believe there's a little something else on your side.
Stone turned and glanced at the tall, bald-headed black man. There were always more sides to Kenyatta than the black leader would let on to, and it always surprised Stone when he would reveal another aspect to him. It took Kenyatta and Stone a couple of hours to find a room in the jammed town, but finally they located one in a small motel in the northern section just past downtown, which was called The Palms. Rufus and Edgar, following directly behind in the Chevy, took the room next door and a small group settled in. Inside the room, Kenyatta tied Seamus to the corner of the bed, then sent Rufus out for a bottle of Jack Daniels and some fried chicken. The air conditioner droned on, and the men made themselves comfortable.
"All right, my man,"
Kenyatta began, sitting on the overstuffed chair in the corner of the room.
"It's about time you made your little call. You dig where I'm coming from?"
Wilbur Seamus looked up at Kenyatta, staring balefully at the large black man who had come to mean certain death to the former L.A. hustler.
"Man,"
Seamus began in his high-pitched voice,
"you got yourself a thing going on. Please let me out and I'll make sure you're taken care of."
Kenyatta glanced down toward Stone and laughed loudly.
"Can you dig this dude, Elliot? This man's about ready to sink, and he's begging for his motherfucking life. I've seen some dudes in my time, but this one is about the biggest motherfucker of all."
Elliot Stone moved across the room to where Seamus lay on the floor. He stood above the thin black man and stared down at him with a look that would have melted an iceberg.
"Seamus,"
Stone began in an even colder voice,
"you've been making my man uptight. Now, I suggest you do as he says, lest you want to die a death the likes of which you couldn't imagine."
Kenyatta watched Seamus, then raised a glass of Jack Daniels to his lips and took a huge swig. He had seen men in the throes of terror before, and most men would react in much the same way. It was the common, unspoken admission of pure terror and horror. A man could only go on for so long before his control gave out. Seamus had just evaporated.
"Now listen, man,"
Kenyatta began softly.
"We ain't gonna hurt you. Just make that call. Set it up, you dig?"
Seamus looked pleadingly at Kenyatta.
"Man, you don't know these people. You got the number. You call them. I got to get out, Kenyatta. They'll kill me."
Kenyatta lifted himself off the chair and moved beside Stone. Both men stared down at the pathetic figure.
"Elliot,"
Kenyatta began,
"this dude is begging for his life. I just wonder how many poor fuckers he's responsible for killing just so he could wear these fine threads. And he's just pissed in like a schoolchild." "Ain't no way to tell, Ken,"
Stone replied.
"Man's pushed a lot of dope into our community. A whole lot."
Seamus looked from one to the other, realizing that there was no chance for him with men like these. All his life, the ghetto pusher had been dealing with men who could be bought, men to whom the dollar was the common denominator of all existence. Once a man left that realm, dudes like Seamus were incapable of understanding them, let alone dealing with them.
"Well,"
Kenyatta said finally,
"looks like our man has a choice. I mean, we either cut his off right here, or we give him the chance to make that call. Pretty good fucking choice if you ask me."
The thin black man cringed.
"Okay, man. I'll make the motherfucking call."
Kenyatta turned and went back to his chair. Stone reached for the phone, tapped for an outside number, and gave the receiver to Seamus. As Seamus asked the operator to dial the number, Kenyatta listened making sure it was the same one that Manning had given him out on the desert earlier that night. Seamus spoke with his man for a minute, then held the receiver away from his ear.
He wants to meet at the sand dunes, 10 miles north of here.
Kenyatta shook his head.
No fucking way. We meet at his place, where he lives, or we don't meet at all.
Seamus relayed the message. Finally, he nodded his head and turned back to Kenyatta.
10, tomorrow night,
he said.
Ish. We make it at midnight,
Kenyatta replied. After a few more minutes on the phone, Seamus reached an agreement. He hung up the phone and turned to Kenyatta.
Midnight, tomorrow night, the Sands Hotel, the penthouse suite.
Stone whistled.
Penthouse suite, huh? That's too much, man. From the fucking streets of Watts to a penthouse suite in Vegas. Man, I never thought I'd make it.
Kenyatta laughed.
Elliot, baby, you have made it. Only fuckers around here who aren't gonna make it are the god pusher men.
Seamus sat on the floor. His hand rested on the telephone. His black knuckles were white. He was gripping the plastic machine as though it was the last thing on earth he would ever touch. He tried to think, attempted to come up with some way of getting himself out of what was coming down. But no matter how hard he tried, there was nothing. His mind had been paralyzed with fear. While Seamus sat alone, drifting into a state of complete fear, Rufus and Edgar returned with the fried chicken. The four men turned on the television set and watched a baseball game, and ate and drank as though they were in Las Vegas with the same intention of having fun that everyone else in town had. While Kenyatta and his men sat in their room at the Palms Motel, a virtual caravan of automobiles was heading up the 4-lane freeway out of Los Angeles and into Las Vegas. Kenyatta's men in the districts of L.A. had gathered after the leader's message had been received from Barstow earlier that evening. Preparations had already been made by Stonewall, and the various groups of men within the organization had been gathering since early that Friday. All told, the group consisted of 38 black men, all of them indoctrinated into Kenyatta's philosophy, most of them with families and all of them highly trained in the use of weapons. Outside Stonewall's home, the 8 automobiles were parked. In the trunks of each was a small arsenal, pistols, rifles, and shotguns. The men moved quietly and efficiently in the quiet neighborhood street in Compton. Black men with more than 2 cars at one time always drew attention, no matter how innocent their activity. On this night, their activities were something a little more than innocent, and they tried to be careful. By 11 o'clock, the caravan was ready. Each car left, carrying at least 4 men dressed in business suits towards Las Vegas. Half the cars took the desert route through Lancaster and Mojave. The other half rode the San Bernardino freeway, then cut over the Angeles Mountains and down into the desert town of Victorville. At about 4 in the morning, the 8 cars would enter the town of Las Vegas. Each of the passengers would be dropped at a different casino where they would have a little breakfast and play the slot machines. The men would wait there until the drivers came back and picked them up. When that pickup would occur would depend upon Kenyatta, who would meet with his 4 district leaders in a small coffee shop on the outskirts of the desert town. After making sure the cars and men were inconspicuously slotted in the many casinos throughout town, Stonewall drove up Las Vegas Boulevard, past the luxurious strip hotels, and headed through the downtown area. Finally, he reached the Palms Motel and pulled into the parking lot next to Kenyatta's Cadillac. Kenyatta was inside the room watching a late-night western on television and sipping his Jack Daniels. Elliot Stone was asleep on the couch, and Seamus was curled up on the floor, his hands and feet bound to the bed. Kenyatta flinched at the first knock on the door, then bounded to his feet, pulling out his .38 and holding it at his side.
Yeah?
He asked. Stonewall identified himself, and Kenyatta opened the door. The two sat opposite each other in front of the television, speaking in whispers. "Everyone here?" Kenyatta asked. "Yeah, we took separate routes. They're spread out all around town, just waiting for the word." Kenyatta paused as he filled Stonewall's glass with some whiskey. The tall, slim black man raised his glass and saluted Kenyatta.
"Ken,"
Stonewall began after taking a long swig.
"you gotta level with me."
Sure, man. I dig where you're coming from.
Kenyatta replied.
"Who is it, man? I mean, we got ourselves a fucking army in this town, and ain't no one knows what it's about, you dig?"
Kenyatta set his glass down on the small table.
Stonewall, we don't know who this fucker is. All we know is that we're meeting at the Sands tomorrow night, midnight, the same time Sinatra opens at Caesar's. Aside from that, and possibly our little pusher friend down there, no one knows nothing.
Stonewall leaned back in his chair.
"You mean you got this contact going at the Sands? This dude must be big, man."
Gotta be,
Kenyatta replied.
Ain't no way a man corners a market like L.A. and ain't big, you dig?
"Yeah,"
Stonewall mused, staring down at his hands.
"I just wonder. I mean, the dude's that big? We're walking into the same fucking trap or what?"
Kenyatta shrugged, then leaned forward, earnestly looking Stonewall in the eyes.
Man, we come this far, this close. We got close to 40 men out there, ready and willing. We ain't never been in a better position to get it on than we are now.
"You're right, Ken,"
Stonewall replied.
"but we gotta be careful."
The large, bald black man reached for a cigarette and lit it. He exhaled the smoke slowly and thoughtfully.
Who we got at the Sands? I mean, right now.
Stonewall thought for a moment, then said,
"Roscoe Baker. Good young dude out of Compton."
Can you get in touch with him?
Kenyatta asked.
I mean, right now?
"Sure, we got a code. I page him, then tell him Gloria is ready. He comes out to the parking lot 15 minutes later."
Kenyatta smiled.
Okay, page him now.
While Stonewall paged Baker at the Sands, Kenyatta woke up Stone. He told him to watch the place for an hour. Quickly, Elliot Stone jumped into a state of total alertness, another aspect of his training with Kenyatta. Kenyatta and Stonewall climbed into the Cadillac and headed towards the Strip. When they reached the Sands, they pulled into the parking lot near the large fountain.
How long has it been?
Kenyatta asked when they had waited for a few minutes. Stonewall checked his watch.
"Should be any second now,"
he replied. At that moment, a young hip-looking black dude with a stylish afro appeared at the doorway, scanning the parking lot. He spotted the large Cadillac and ambled across the pavement toward Kenyatta and Stonewall. Roscoe Baker peered into the car, recognized Stonewall, and climbed into the back seat.
"What's happening?"
Baker asked in a low, easy voice.
"This here,"
Stonewall began.
"is Kenyatta."
The reaction was potent as Baker reached across the seat and grasped Kenyatta's hand in a thumb shake.
"Man,"
Baker said.
"it's a groove."
Same here,
Kenyatta replied.
"We need some work done, and quick,"
Stonewall began.
Right,
Kenyatta continued.
We need you to go inside the Sands, check out everything you can about the place, the elevators, the access to the penthouse, where the security guards are, the back entrances, service entrances, everything. You dig where I'm coming from?
Baker nodded, then looked towards Stonewall.
"Then what?"
The young black asked.
"Then," Stonewall replied, "grab a taxi and have him take you to the Palms Motel on North Las Vegas Drive, room 16. We'll be there waiting."
Baker nodded, then turned to Kenyatta.
"I'll be there in an hour, Kenyatta."
Good man.
Kenyatta smiled, then shook the young man's hand. In the flash, Baker was out of the car and gliding across the lot as though he were a young stud on the prowl. Kenyatta watched him for a moment, then turned to Stonewall.
Looks like a righteous dude,
He said.
All our cats,
Stonewall said.
are righteous dudes.
Kenyatta looked at his old friend and smiled. He drove through the parking lot and headed back to the small motel. Within an hour, Roscoe Baker appeared at the motel. Elliot Stone opened the door and escorted him inside. They turned on the lights and gathered around the small desk table in the center of the room. Seamus watched the men from the floor, powerless to do or say anything. Baker squatted among the group of men, spreading out a large piece of notebook paper upon which he had drawn a map and diagram of the Sands Hotel.
This,
Baker began.
is that Sands first floor. It's as far as the will let me get, but I got enough.
Kenyatta stared at the map, tracing the rear hallways that ran behind the casino and the entrances that were behind the hotel. The front elevators and lobby were impossible. What he was after was a more accessible route, some way to get to the top.
You see,
Baker continued, pointing out the rear parking lot.
the loading docks for food are here. Elevators to the third floor kitchen are right there.
Stone smiled at Kenyatta, then spoke.
Ken, if those f***ing elevators go to the kitchen on the third floor, they must have chutes going all the way to the top. I mean room service and all that shit. You dig where I'm coming from?
No doubt, Kenyatta said excitedly.
Got to be chutes. I think we got our way inside.
Seamus watched the men closely, listened to their conversation, and began to tremble again. His one outside chance of survival would be if Kenyatta could not get his men into the hotel. If that was prevented, then it would be possible for Seamus to sound some kind of warning when he met with Oscar Manning. Otherwise, chaos would ensue, and surely Seamus will become a victim. Outside the small motel room, the sun was rising over the desert. Rays of pink sunshine poured into the room, illuminating the faces of the men gathered there with a strange orange glow. The half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels sat on the desk beside the map of the Sands. Kenyatta, Stone, Baker, and Stonewall sat facing each other, sipping slowly on their drinks. The excitement and the tension were building, and the men gathered inside the room were feeling it. Each man was sitting back as the sun rose, in his own mind, contemplating what was to happen some 18 hours from that moment. Each man knew that this was the biggest attempt at anything he had ever been involved in. The soothing desert sunrise only made their feelings of anticipation and apprehension that much more real.